A life hidden in secrets. Oliver Bryant had always been a quiet man. He was a man who preferred the hum of an engine over the chatter of people. Born into a life of poverty in a small southern town, he had spent his childhood watching men like his father struggle against a system designed to keep them down. His father, a factory worker, had labored from dawn until dusk, his hands rough and calloused from years of hard work, yet still earning barely enough to make ends meet. His mother had worked as a maid in white homes, cleaning floors and doing laundry for families who never acknowledged her sacrifice. Oliver had learned early on that the world he lived in had a way of determining where you belonged, by the color of your skin, by the weight of your family's name, by the size of your bank account. At 18, Oliver had learned enough to know that in the world he lived, love was not enough. He worked as a mechanic at a small shop, fixing cars and machines that could barely afford to be fixed, but it was honest work. It was one of the few jobs a black man could hold without feeling the sting of a white man's authority. He had learned the way engines breathe, the way they groaned under pressure. But beyond that, he had learned to tread carefully in a world that didn't want him there. His tall, lean frame, dark as polished mahogany, made him a target in a world that demanded compliance. He kept his eyes on the ground, never lingering too long on anything that might attract attention. The world of race relations was a constant undercurrent in Oliver's life. He had seen the cruelty of Jim Crow laws firsthand. The South, where he grew up, was a place where black men could be beaten, imprisoned, or worse for stepping out of line, and no one would bat an eye. The North wasn't as brutal, but the color lines were still sharply drawn. Black men, no matter how hardworking, no matter how intelligent, had no place in a world that was ruled by a white elite. So, Oliver kept to his corner, did his job, and lived his life as best he could. But deep down, he always believed that love could overcome any obstacle, no matter how impossible it seemed. That belief was put to the test the day he met Sarah Whitmore. Sarah was nothing like any white woman Oliver had ever known. She was the daughter of Charles Whitmore, a wealthy businessman who controlled much of the town with his wealth and influence. Sarah's life had been set out for her long before she was born. She had been groomed to be the perfect Southern lady, quiet, obedient, and always well-mannered. She wore silk dresses and attended social events designed to mold her into the perfect wife for a man of her status. But none of that mattered to Sarah. She was suffocating in her perfect, gilded cage. She longed for something more, something beyond the expectations that weighed her down every day. Sarah was 18 when she first saw Oliver. It was summer, the air thick with humidity, and the smell of fresh-cut grass hung in the air. She had spent the evening at a party in a small, dimly lit basement where jazz music played and young people, black and white alike, mingled under the cover of darkness. It was one of the few places in town where color lines blurred, where, for a few hours, it didn't matter if you were black or white. Everyone was simply a person, enjoying the freedom of the night. That night, Sarah saw Oliver across the room, his presence magnetic, pulling her in like gravity. He stood at the edge of the room, his posture relaxed, but there was an air of quiet confidence about him. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, but when they landed on Sarah, something shifted. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, there was no hesitation, no fear. Sarah moved toward him, her heart beating faster with each step. She didn't know why, but something told her she needed to talk to him. Oliver had seen her before, but he had learned to avoid the glances of white women. He knew the dangers of letting his eyes linger, of inviting attention. But when Sarah walked up to him, he didn't look away. Instead, he found himself speaking to her, his voice low and cautious, as if testing the waters. She asked him his name, and the way she said it, curious, warm, without fear, touched him in a way he hadn't expected. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, as if the barriers between them didn't exist. She asked him about his life, his work, and in return he learned that she wasn't like the women he had known. She wasn't sheltered or naive. She had a fire in her eyes, a spark of curiosity that made her different from anyone Oliver had ever encountered. They talked for hours, oblivious to the passing time, the music, and the world around them. There was something intoxicating about her openness, her lack of fear when she spoke to him. As the night came to an end, Sarah whispered that she wanted to see him again. Oliver knew he should walk away. He should forget this encounter, forget the way she had made him feel seen, valued. But he didn't. He couldn't. Over the next few weeks, their secret meetings continued. Sarah would slip away from her father's house under the cover of darkness, meeting Oliver in places where no one could see them together. Their love grew, forbidden but undeniable. But the dangers they faced were never far from their minds. Oliver had always known that interracial relationships were not just frowned upon. They were dangerous. He had heard the whispers, the threats, the rumors. But with Sarah, he found something he had never dared to hope for, a love that transcended color, a love that defied the world they lived in. However, love was never easy. The first time Sarah's father, Charles Whitmore, saw them together, it was by accident. Oliver had been working late at the auto shop when Sarah showed up, standing in the dim light of the street lamp. Oliver's heart stopped. He knew it wasn't safe for her to be there, not with the risk of Charles finding out. But before he could say anything, a black car pulled up to the curb. Charles Whitmore stepped out, his face twisted in fury. Oliver's heart raced. This was it, the moment of truth. The realization that Sarah's father had discovered them hit him like a tidal wave. He watched as Charles grabbed Sarah by the arm, dragging her away without a word. Sarah tried to speak, but her father's cold glare silenced her. Oliver knew better than to follow. There were no second chances for a black man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The next morning, Oliver found a note slipped under the door of his shop. "Stay away from my daughter." It wasn't a warning. It was a command, a threat that hung over him like a dark cloud. But for the first time, Oliver realized something more terrifying than the fear of white men like Charles Whitmore. He was afraid of what he was willing to risk for Sarah. He didn't know it then, but the journey they were about to take would change everything. Their love, once a secret, would soon be forced into the light, and the consequences would be more dangerous than they could ever imagine. The unspoken truth. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, a quiet tension that settled in the corners of their small home in Illinois. The town, though far removed from the oppressive heat of the South, was still a place where two people like Oliver and Sarah would never truly feel at ease. But for them, it was enough. It had to be enough. Life had taken a turn they never could have anticipated. The factory town, with its smoky air and worn-out buildings, had become their refuge. It was a far cry from the elegant streets of Sarah's childhood, but it offered them something more. Freedom, of a sort. It wasn't acceptance, but it was indifference. Here, in the gritty anonymity of a working-class town, no one paid much attention to the couple walking down the street. They had found their place, their rhythm, and they moved through life together, side by side. Oliver worked long hours in the steel mill, his body worn and aching at the end of each day. Sarah, too, had found work as a seamstress, her hands no longer soft, but calloused from the needle and thread. It was grueling work, and the hours were long, but they endured. They had no other choice. Together, they learned to stretch every dollar, barter for food, and make do with what little they had. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. Yet, as the years passed, the shadow of Sarah's past, her father's wrath, loomed over them. Though her father's letters had stopped coming, the fear never quite left her. Every time a man in a suit looked at her too long, every time someone with too much power crossed her path, a flicker of dread would rise in her chest. She knew that one day her father would find them. He was a man of influence, a man who would never forgive his daughter for choosing a life that didn't fit into the narrow world he had crafted for her. It was this fear that drove Sarah to make the decision that would ultimately shape the course of her life. Without telling Oliver, she began to save money, a few coins at a time, tucked beneath the mattress, sewn into the hem of her dresses. It was a precaution, nothing more, she told herself. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about money. It was about preparing for the day when the past would catch up with them, and she would have to make a choice that could tear their lives apart. Then, one evening, the knock on the door came. It wasn't the sound of a friendly visitor. It wasn't the familiar tap of a neighbor seeking conversation or assistance. This knock was heavy, urgent, like a warning that something was about to change. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen it in the movies, heard the stories from others in her town. People who had learned the hard way that sometimes, no matter how far you run, the past catches up with you. Oliver, who had been sitting at the small kitchen table reading a worn newspaper, stood up, his brow furrowed in confusion. He had no idea what this was about, but Sarah could feel the familiar tension in his posture, the readiness to protect, to shield her from whatever danger lurked outside. "I'll answer it," he said, his voice calm but firm. Before Sarah could stop him, he was already at the door, pulling it open with a slight creak. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she watched the figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, middle-aged, with an air of authority about him, dressed in a well-tailored suit. His face, stern and unreadable, was a mask of professionalism. But Sarah knew immediately who he was, her father's lawyer. The words were slow, deliberate, as the man spoke. "Mrs. Bryant, I regret to inform you that your father has passed away. There are matters that require your immediate attention. His will stipulates your involvement." The world seemed to spin in Sarah's mind. It wasn't just the news of her father's death, though that in itself was enough to send a wave of relief and guilt crashing over her. It was the realization that her father's influence hadn't just died with him. His reach, his power, was still very much alive in the form of this lawyer, who had come to reclaim what he believed was his, even in death. Oliver glanced at Sarah, sensing the sudden change in the air. He hadn't known much about Sarah's past. She had shared the basics, about her family, about the father who had disapproved of their love. But he didn't know the full extent of the bitterness that had existed between Sarah and her family. He didn't know the lengths her father had gone to keep her from him. "Come inside," Oliver said, his voice soft but steady. "Let's talk about this." The lawyer stepped inside, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The weight of the past and present hung in the air, thick with unspoken words. "Sarah," the lawyer continued, looking at her with a cold, clinical expression, "your father left behind a significant inheritance, but it's conditional. The will states that you must relinquish your marriage to Mr. Bryant in order to claim what is rightfully yours." Your father's wish was clear. Sarah's world seemed to collapse in that moment. The life she had fought for, the life she had built with Oliver, was suddenly on the line. The wealth, the position she had left behind, it all seemed so far away now, a distant memory of a life she had once known. But the price of claiming it was too high. Too much had been sacrificed. Too much had been lost in the name of love. "I won't leave him," Sarah whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I won't choose anything over my love for Oliver. Not even my father's money." The lawyer's face tightened, a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He had expected this. It wasn't the first time someone had rejected the offer, but it didn't make the sting of failure any less bitter. "I'll leave it to you then," he said, his voice cold and final. "Your father made his choice clear. There will be no second chance." With that, the lawyer turned and left, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the house. Oliver looked at Sarah, his expression unreadable. He had always known there was something about her past that haunted her, something that she had kept hidden away. But this was beyond anything he had imagined. "I don't need anything from him, Sarah," Oliver said softly, his hand finding hers. "I have everything I need right here with you." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of fear or regret. They were tears of release, of freedom from the chains her father had tried to bind her with, even in death. She had chosen Oliver, And now, the choice was made. The past no longer had a hold on her. She was free. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The secrets she had kept hidden, the fears she had carried alone, were now laid bare. There was nothing left to fear. Her love for Oliver had always been the truth that had guided her through the darkness. And now she was free to live it fully. In the years that followed, Sarah and Oliver built a life together, not on the inheritance her father had left behind, but on the love and resilience they had created for themselves. They raised children, they struggled, they fought, but they never gave up on each other. And in the end, it was that love, that choice to live truthfully, that proved to be the most valuable inheritance of all. As Sarah looked back on her life, on the years she had spent running from her past, she realized that the greatest gift her father had ever given her was the choice to live her own life, on her terms. And in the end, it was that choice that had set her free. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.